Folks, hello and welcome. If you're joining us for the first time, you're especially welcome. This is the live Apologetics Academy, which I run regularly on Saturdays. And the idea is that we bring on different apologists, thinkers, speakers, philosophers, scientists from across the theological and philosophical spectrum to present on topics of interest to Christians, especially those topics which bear on the existence of God or the truth of Christianity. And we also, of course, cross-examine and evaluate other worldviews and systems as well. The website is apologetics-academy.org. I post updates there about upcoming webinars, and you can also find out about what I'm up to there as well. The usual format for these discussions is we have a special guest speaker who presents on his area of interest or research for up to an hour. And then we open up to open floor Q&A and discussion and dialogue. When we get to the Q&A, there's a number of ways you can participate. You can submit a question, but in textual form, anonymously if you wish, by hitting the Q&A button at the top of your screen. You can also interact live with the speaker by clicking the raise hand button at the top of your screen. And at the Q&A time, I will promote you to be a co-panelist with our guest speaker, and you can interact and go back and forth a bit on a particular topic that you want to ask about. You can also, of course, participate in the live chat. Please submit your chat to everyone rather than just panelists. That would be excellent. Let's turn over to our guest speaker, who this week we're very honored to have with us Dr. Joshua Swamidass, who is a biologist. He is a well-known blogger at the blog Peaceful Science, and he has achieved some fame for his recent critique of Mike Behe's book and intelligent design, of course, more broadly and generally. Recently, his critique of Mike Behe's Darwin Devolves, which you can see on the PowerPoint slide on the screen. He was one of the co-authors in a recent article in the journal Science, critiquing Behe's book, and so I've invited him to discuss this book with us today. So Joshua, over to you. Great to have you.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's really, I really respect you for having me here with all of the back and forth that's been going on. I think it's great to be able to interact directly with a larger community about this and hopefully have some real progress as we understand each other better. So I'm going to be talking to you today about our critique of Darwin Devolves. And in my mind, I know that actually it's far more important. Well, let's put it this way. It's not enough to be right. We also have to be trusted. So what I'm going to do is explain a little bit about who I am first, so you can understand that I'm not out to get intelligent design. I'm really have friends there. I'm really trying to make sense of this. And honestly, if I miss something important, I really want to know so I can fix it and get it right. For me, what's really driving this is just to get the truth straight and to really tolerate disagreements and have people together working this out. And I know that's not how everyone's going to see me right now, so I'm going to explain a little bit about how you can know that's true about me, and then I'm going to get into a couple key criticisms about Darwin Devolves. The first thing about me is I'm a scientist. I'm a computational biologist. That means that I'm trained to use math and mathematical models and simulation and machine learning to understand biology. I'm not working for an origins advocacy group. That means that I'm not actually promoting any particular solution to how we think about origins as a Christian. I just really want us as Christians to say sensible things in public about it. I personally affirm common descent and evolution. We'll talk about that, but I'm not a theistic evolutionist. If you don't know how to make sense of that, I'm happy to answer that in questions. But this is where I work. It's one of the largest medical scientific complexes in the country. I'm a medical doctor, but I'm also a scientist. You can see an arrow pointing to where one of my offices are. My other office is way over here. This is all essentially WashU's Medical Center where I work. Most of the work I do is predicting how drugs become toxic or not. It doesn't even really have anything to do with origins per se. However, I have also been publishing in that area, most recently a ton of stuff looking at population genetics. I think the thing that really has driven my involvement in there is both being a Christian, being a scientist, but then also really understanding how to look at complex questions of biology from a mathematical and simulation point of view. I'm also a Christian, so I'm a scientist, but I'm also a Christian. And I can forgive you for thinking that I'm only about arguing against intelligent design. That's not true. Actually, most of what I do has really nothing to do with intelligent design. And what I mean by Christian, let me explain that and give you a couple hooks to look into this further, is I really believe that Jesus rose from the dead. For me, I think there are arguments for design that are interesting, but the strongest argument that God exists and good and wants to be known is what Paul gives in 1 Corinthians 15. That according to Scripture, which means according to prophecy, Jesus died for our sins and he was buried. He rose from the dead and he was seen by many. And he was seen by me too. I think that one of the complicated things for me or for my colleagues is that I talk about how Jesus really rose from the dead. I believe he's active in this world. I trust him more than I trust science in the end. And, through this whole back and forth with discovery, there was 2 articles published that I really want to encourage people to take a look at. One was by Daniel Ang, who's a PhD student at Harvard in physics, who writes a phenomenal explanation of why he came to affirm that Jesus rose from the dead. There's also Zachary Ardern, who is a postdoc in evolutionary biology, who is known to some of you already, who also wrote an article explaining why, as a scientist and evolutionary biologist, he comes to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. This is something that I think is really missing in the conversation right now, which is scientists confessing that fact and explaining it. That, I would say, is far more important to me than arguing against design. It's in some ways unfortunate that that's how I'm becoming known, but I'm spending much more time explaining this than really anything having to do with disagreeing with Behe. Oops. I also do a lot of work with Veritas forums. This is me with Alan Lightman at MIT. And this is also the introductory slide from a talk I gave out in Hong Kong just this fall. I normally do around 4 to 5 Veritas forums around the country, engaging with atheists, explaining in how I make sense of being a Christian as a scientist. But the reason I'm here today is because of this review. It's in Science. It's called The End of Evolution. The subtitle is unfortunate. We didn't choose it. It was given to us, and unfortunately ended up being the title of the blog post. But we chose the much less aggressive The End of Evolution with a question mark. It was written with Nathan Lentz, you can see here, and also Richard Lenski. Nathan Lentz is a person who may be known to you because he's recently written a book called Human Errors. The 2 of us became friends over the last year, and he approached me about co-authoring this review with him. He also approached Richard Lenski, who is a central part of Behe's book and his experiment. The way how it's been explained to me, and I think it's true, is that in evolution circles, Richard Lenski is essentially royalty. So it is an incredible privilege to have co-authored this review. Our final assessment was not positive, though we did avoid, I'm glad to say, as even E and V agree, that we avoided all ad hominems or insults and all that. But what we did say is that in the end, that Darwin Devolves fails to challenge modern evolutionary science because, once again, Behe does not fully engage with it. He misrepresents the theory and avoids the evidence that challenges him. That's our assessment. If you look in this article, it's very short. Science is a really prestigious journal. It tends to, well, they always limit the number of words you have very tightly. They wanted this to be in just a single page. So we understood it just as a table of contents that we were going to expand later. And that is exactly what we've done. There's been around 10 to 15 articles published and several detailed responses to the Discovery Institute. There's been well over 15, if not 20 articles by the Discovery Institute now engaging with us. And there's 12 references in this article. I think all of them but one has been gone back and forth in detail with the Discovery Institute. So I'm entirely comfortable we can and will explain how we came to that assessment. Now, if we miss something, I want to know. That's part of the reason why we're really trying to engage with ID through this. But I do want to direct you to this much more important review. It's called Evolution Unscathed. It's written by 2 of Behe's colleagues. They're both assistant professors. One of them is Gregory Lang, another one's Amber Rice. They're both known to Behe. They're friendly with him. They're kind to him in this review on a personal level. This review is much larger. It gets into far more detail, and it is extremely clear and cogent and well explained. If you really want to understand the scientific side, this is really the go-to place to start. All right, so that's why I'm here. But I want to start by pointing out that I really agree with Behe on a lot of things. This is important because it's really from that place of common ground and agreement that I'm disagreeing with him on something that's actually fairly minor from some points of view, even though it might seem major from other points of view. There's a blog post I wrote about this that I'd encourage you to look at and see how this is explained in more detail. So I said this publicly. This is known by my co-authors, and they were not angry with me about it, though I don't know if it was exactly comfortable for them either. The first thing is I really believe that God designed us all just like Behe. I reject Darwinism just like him, but in a different way that still affirms evolutionary science. We're both challenging the consensus, and I really respect that about him. We both affirm common descent. And then one that I'm going to add and explain a little more is that we both think that the bad design argument is a really bad argument against design. So first of all, I want to point out that I really do believe that God designed us all. So these two pictures, one shows Mount Everest, the other one shows Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore is somewhat of an icon of ID. Dembski points to it as an example of design that can be detected. But honestly, I think biology is a lot more like Mount Everest. I see its looming beauty and power, and I see a God that's capable of much more beauty and power than I am, and it certainly makes these things in a different way than I would imagine. For me, biology looks a lot more like Everest. I believe God designed it. I think we can make a case for it. I don't think that case looks very much like showing Mount Rushmore's design. And I think also, because I'm so certain of it, because I found this to be true by other means as well, I think it's important, at least for me, to only take the best arguments forwards and let go of the weaker ones, or certainly let go of the fallacious ones. The way how both Behe and I reject Darwinism is important. We both reject ideological and anti-religious atheism. That's one definition of Darwinism. I think it's well represented at times by Dawkins. I think I would point out too that actually quite a few atheists in science reject ideological anti-religious atheism. There's been several that have really found that distasteful. I would point out, for example, Richard Lenski is in an agnostic atheist point of view. He rejects this version of atheism too. He is not anti-religious. The other type of Darwinism or definition is entirely naturalistic. I don't think that there's anything in science that tells us that God was not involved or didn't do anything. So, and I just don't think that you can make that case strongly. I think that it's possible that God did something. I don't think science really considers that question or has the tools to. So I reject naturalistic evolution in that regard. And then this third one is actually fairly important to understand. The other definition of Darwinism is the technical definition, which is the one that Behe spends quite a bit of time arguing against, which is positive selection dominated change. It was replaced in 1968 when I think Behe was in high school by Motoo Kimura. And I reject that version of Darwinism too. It doesn't really explain much at all. It's not that selection isn't important, it is, but there's non-Darwinian mechanisms that are important too. And in general, this gets to one of the places where I'm uncomfortable with Behe's critique. We both reject Darwinism, but science moved on from Darwinism in this form a long time ago. So demonstrating that this type of Darwinism isn't enough isn't really a strong critique of current evolutionary science. And I also want to point out that we both agree it's important to challenge the consensus. And there's several ways that I've done that. It's well known how Behe is. One is that I've agreed with ID proponents publicly when they were right. It's happened several times. I'll give a couple examples. Probably most in the spotlight in public was with Ann Gager and Richard Buggs in their exchange with Dennis Venema. They had a point, and I helped make that with them. And I aligned with them on that, and that was risky to do. It was when I didn't have tenure. And I did that because I think it's important to be truthful and honest about these things. And even if that puts me at risk, it was worth doing it. Another thing where I deviate from most of my colleagues is in attempting to give ID a fair hearing. I've written about this on my blog as well too. It's called A Fair Hearing for Behe. I encourage you to look at that. I really think it's important that ID and creationist science as well gets a fair hearing. If we miss something, I want to know. And instead of being on the outside, I want to invite you to just show up, explain where we are, show me where I'm wrong, and let's make sense of this together. In particular, I want to really highlight Winston Urt, who is actually in this call, which I'm really glad to have him here for. And he came about a year ago, actually, and shared about the dependency graph of life. We gathered a group of scientists to engage with him, and his work was really positively reviewed. I don't think he's fully made his case. He has some remaining questions to deal with, but we really respect this side of ID, of actually engaging with the data, building models, not overstating what you found, and really trying to make progress. And in fact, I really want to see that type of intelligent design really grow. It's something that I honestly want to see more of. I think it'll produce interesting things. And I think it's also something that's not going to be distasteful to scientists that I know, or at least my colleagues. The other thing too, I just want to point out is I'm in the middle of writing a book on the science of Adam and Eve, and how the scientific consensus at times has really overstated how much we know about that, and that there's space for much more conservative understandings of how we think about origins. This is a place where I did this once again before I had tenure. I started taking this case forward, and I've been including ID proponents in thinking through this from a scientific point of view and a theological point of view. Walter Bradley and Engager have been writing about, have been engaging Walter Bradley, but then also writing about Engager quite a bit. So this is something where I would say I'm taking forward ideas that are a little bit surprising for people. Finally, and I'm going to explain this a little bit more, is this question about bad design as being a bad argument. I would say it's the consensus that bad design just demonstrates that design is not true. I think this is really a poorly conceived argument, both scientifically and theologically, and scientists shouldn't be making theological arguments like that and claiming their science. I also agree with him that we share common ancestry with the great apes. I can explain this later, but right now common ancestry produces the only mathematical model that explains why mice and rats are more different than humans and chimpanzees. Getting to this bad design argument, and this will give you a little more understanding of where I'm coming from, and also Nathan Lentz. Nathan Lentz published a book called Human Errors. He got into a back and forth with discovery. While that was happening, I actually publicly pointed out that he wasn't making a strong argument on this. He backtracked in a very appropriate professional way. And I have a lot of respect for him on that. That's what scientists do. When you point out things in a gentle way that makes sense, they backtrack. And even they'll do it when you don't always point it out in a good way. Once again, about Nathan Lentz, to give you a sense of how I've really come to respect him as an honest, good faith participant in this conversation, even though he is a secular scientist and is not a Christian. In the exchange with Discovery, he made a factual mistake in how he described parasinuses. Michael Enger at ENV pointed this out. He conceded, actually, that Michael Enger was correct. I also did too, and this has all happened publicly. That is exactly how scientists do things. When they make errors, they publicly acknowledge them and retract them. That's what Nathan did. This is an example where he's been corrected by people in the Discovery Institute. Now, that didn't change his argument in some ways, and that's okay. Sometimes small things we make mistakes on and the large argument continues, but the way how we build trust is by being willing to concede small points. So these are all the ways that I agree with Behe, and I could actually list more, and I'm actually thinking about writing another blog post to explain it. I agree with him that God designed us all, in the sense that he created us all, and in that sense, he created us through a process of common descent. We both reject Darwinism in those three ways. We're both challenging the consensus in different ways because we found things that are more important. We both affirm common descent, and we both think the bad design argument is a bad argument. And from this, you will find out at AMV, it is often a bit of a complex relationship they have with me. This is from early on in the conversation. You can see Ann Gager here from the Discovery, William Lane Craig, who is a leading apologist, and here is A.J. Roberts from Reasons to Believe. All of them here at Washington University discussing the work I'm doing on Adam and Eve, as we really chose to include them. And here, this is on the front page of END, and then right next to it, you have a review from Brian Miller, who is right here saying that we relied on circular reasoning, and then one from David Klinghoffer saying that we were having a panic attack. Well, that didn't happen. I think this is just going to be the complex situation we're in, where we are making a legitimate offer to include intelligent design, but we also disagree. It's going to be complex because I don't know if Discovery Institute has really had many critics like me before. I'll tell you that right now that I think I'm deeply interested in the intelligent design movement, and the reason why is because I'm breaking the rule. The rule that I've had explained to me more or less by several people is that if I'm going to be a friend of ID, I need to publicly support ID when I agree, and then I need to stay out of it when I disagree. That's what I've been told the rules are, and I've definitely lived by the first one, and I'm definitely breaking the rule on the second one. When I disagree, I'm public about it. And I think this is really disconcerting for people at the Discovery Institute. It's confusing for them. I've been called duplicitous because of this. I think maybe what's going on here is really just a difference in values and a difference in culture. In scientific culture, this is just the rules. This is how it works. That's why I'm allowed to tell Nathan when I think he's wrong. And that's why Art and I can get back and forth with him. Art Hunt, who's another scientist on our site, and we don't take it personally because we'll publicly support each other when we agree, and we'll publicly disagree with each other too. That's how science works. And in the end, I really care about just being upfront with people and getting the truth out. And I don't think that works if we're only half truthful. I think we have to be truthful in public, especially as leaders. We have to be public about our agreements and disagreements. I know that's not how the intelligent design movement works right now. That's just how I work. And I think because of those reasons, we're just going to be in conflict, or I'm going to be confusing and untrusted for a while, and I'm okay with that. So let's get to the scientific side, which is Behe's first rule. Now you can understand a little more where I'm coming from on this. He says that the first rule of adaptive evolution is that natural selection works to break or blunt any gene whenever it'll lead to fitness at the organism level. So this means that he wants to define whether a gene is working well or not, or it's broken. There are several definitions he offers. I won't get into the details explaining them right this moment, but his idea is that, well, usually it's easier to break a gene, and because of that, it's more likely that that will cause an improvement in fitness. So if you do natural selection at the organismal level, it's going to be constantly degrading genes or functional control elements, FCTs, at a lower level to the point that evolution becomes self-limiting. That's his point. Now, I think he is right on that. Actually, a lot of people agree with him. The problem, however, is that this is too strict of a Darwinian account. It turns out that he's left out several other ways that complexity and function can be built up. I'll explain this in the coming slides a little more, how it plays out in one example. So if you'll see here, the title of this is a play on irreducible complexity. If you look at the last author, it's Ford Doolittle. And Ford Doolittle, there's a whole appendix devoted to engaging with Doolittle. At no point does Behe actually engage the way how he would explain, for example, the complexity of the coagulation pathway arises. And what I claimed in the review, and I'm going to explain to you how it applies here, as a mechanism to explain how reducible complexity arises, is that Behe's ignoring neutral evolution. What he actually says in the book is that neutral evolution, by definition, cannot produce important mutations or functional mutations. That turns out not to be true. Neutral evolution is really important. There's something called constructive neutral evolution. Behe actually did respond to this paper, but he seems to neglect the fact in his book that neutral evolution can produce complexity. Second, by the way, he does, when I say he ignores neutral evolution, he does mention it in his book. He raises it to say it's not relevant to the question of novelty. That is false. And so therefore he goes forward in his argument ignoring evolution. That's what I mean by ignoring it. It's the same thing with acceptation. He raises acceptation as indirect pathways in the book, but then he ignores it going forward. That's a common rhetorical strategy he does. He will bring it up in one context, show how in that context it's not relevant to his claims, and then he will ignore it going forward. But this is a problem because in the context where he takes it forward, it becomes incredibly important. So I want to explain to you, using a figure from this paper, how you can devolve irreducible complexity using neutral evolution. The first thing I want to point out is about acceptation, or neutral. Let's talk about neutral evolution. The changes being proposed here account for about 99.9% of mutations that are carried from generation to generation. They're not deleterious, they're not positive, they're just neutral. And these are the sorts of things that will happen in neutral evolution. This is a type of evolution, that 99.99% of evolution, that Behe doesn't really engage in once he has dismissed neutral evolution. And this is also important about acceptation. So the way how Behe defines degrading, he talks about breaking or blunting. Now, the way how acceptation works is that there is going to be a function at one time and a new function in the future. Depending on how you define that, any change you can just call de-evolution by just saying that there was a reduction in function. So I've defined that now, and then let's remember irreducible complexity means that there's going to be high interdependence between parts, that there'll be parts that are linked together that they cannot function unless they're working together. And so we can imagine a system that has a part that's working independently. That's A right here. And there's a lot of other parts in that system that don't interact with it because they are set up so they don't screw up other things. They don't gum up the works. Now, biology is messy. There's errors. So what can happen is that protein B, that's not supposed to interact with protein A, can devolve. Instead of having a specific interaction, it can have a less specific interaction. That is an example of breaking and blunting a gene that Behe thinks is going to be extremely common. And that can happen, which will then allow B to glom onto A. Now, A is still going to be active because it's tolerant to fault. Even though B is glomming onto A when it shouldn't be, and it's devolved to the point that it's joined up with A, it doesn't. Now, this is something that Behe, given the definition of devolution he uses, would probably agree can and should happen with high likelihood. Now that we're here, another mutation can happen. And this mutation can now break or blunt the activity of A to make it so it needs to have B binding to it. At first, it was fine working without B, but now it's broken, so it loses the ability to work independently. So now it's stuck to B. That was purely by a process of de-evolution, which Behe would agree should be very easy to do. Mutations like this should be coming fast and frequent. It does not need to be selected for. This could just be established by neutral drift. And then this can continue even further, so that there's several mutations that make it so that there's a tight interdependence now between A and B. And this happened entirely by de-evolution. And this is the definition of irreducible complexity. This is actually what constructive neutral evolution predicts. It's what biologists have thought long before Darwin's black box arose. And what I think is really interesting and useful about Darwin Devolves is that he essentially endorses that de-evolution can produce irreducible complexity, though he doesn't quite realize that. So this is an example of how when you bring back into the conversation neutral evolution and de-evolution, a lot of his arguments start to fall apart from what I understand from a scientific point of view. Now I want to talk about the polar bears. The polar bears have gotten a lot of attention. We spent some time going into detail on this. Art Hunt and Nathan Lentz wrote a blog post about this. We did this before the book was published. It was based on a public first chapter, and he presents this as a key icon in de-evolution. And there's several points we could pick up on, but one that really struck out to us was this quote. And if you read it, he says, well, I'll just quote it out to you. He's talking about a protein called ApoB. Scientists who studied the polar bear's genome detected multiple mutations in ApoB. That's true. And since few experiments can be done with grumpy polar bears, he's an entertaining writer in that way. I like that. They analyze the changes by computer. That's true too. They determined that mutations were likely to be damaging. That turns out to be false. That is likely to degrade or destroy the function of the protein that the genes code for. That also is false. The authors did not determine that the mutations were very likely to be damaging. And they did not conclude that it was likely to be degraded or destroyed in function. They did run a computer analysis, and we found out that Behe misunderstood that analysis. This is the article that he posted, where he left out several key parts. I didn't make this slide. I'm just reporting how Nathan Lentz saw it. He left out an entire column that showed that these predictions weren't as clear as he thought. And he also left out the cases that showed benign mutations. The bigger problem for me is not actually about this. First of all, this is not actually what the scientists concluded. The reason why is because damaging in this table does not mean damaging. The particular programming he's using is quirky. It's not designed to do this. If to be used this way, it should just be saying a change in function. All it's predicting is a change in function. It is not telling us if it's damaging or not. That was a misinterpretation, an error he made in interpreting this. So there's two errors here. One is that he did not correctly represent the conclusions of the scientists involved in this who understood this problem, and then he misunderstood what the actual program was telling him. Lenski explained this in detail in his blog after he published this, and this was tweeted around, and it's not comfortable that this was done. So Behe gave a second response. I want to point out how we read this. And this is stuff that is not complex from a scientific point of view. He did not correct his misquote of the original paper. He still continues to misrepresent that. He did not correct his misunderstanding of the computer analysis. He did add new information, which we actually thought was really excellent, that there was a half knockout in a mice that might have reduced fat in blood. We looked into it further, though, when we found out that he left out that half knockouts have reduced fertility. That really undermines his alternate hypothesis that it has a broken or blunted effect. This, in a lot of ways, is a really clear example of how we believe Behe misrepresents science and ignores evidence against him. Now, I've already shown you one example where people have had a mistake where they corrected it. I've done this too, where I made a mistake and corrected it. This isn't necessarily central to his argument, but I'm really concerned when things are this clear that he can't just come out and say, yeah, I misquoted it, and yeah, I misunderstood the analysis, but here's my argument going forward. And that means that, over and over again, I don't know if I can really trust where he's coming from. When we look into the references he provided, we found additional information that undermines it, and he doesn't present that. This, as I understand it, is not how science works. And I want to point this out too. Once again, I did not actually create this slide. It actually demonstrates me wrong. I told him that he never actually mentions Alan Orr in his entire review. Alan Orr wrote 2 articles that are just phenomenal back about 23 years ago, explaining in detail the problem with Darwin's black box. When I read those several years later, I was relatively shocked at how limited a view of science I'd gotten from reading Intelligent Design, and how his argument had not really been engaged. Alan Orr is a student of Jerry Coyne's, who became a professor, and he also reviewed Darwin's Black Box in about 23 years ago in the New Yorker. What I think is really disturbing, honestly, about this is that he is quoted on the back cover as an endorsement of Behe and Darwin Devolves from 23 years ago, even though he has presented some of the clearest explanations of why irreducible complexity is wrong. In the appendix of this book, Behe purports to give an update to people to show how irreducible complexity is faring, what's doing in the scientific community. He doesn't mention Alan Orr one time. He doesn't mention Mueller's two-step, which Alan Orr brings to the front one time. The only time Alan Orr is brought up is to give the impression that he endorses this book. This, I think, is highly misleading. I do not know the state of Behe's mind or his exact participation in this, but this does not build trust. Let's put it that way. The way how science works is that we have to trust one another to make progress. One of the ways how we really assess trust is how we handle small errors that misrepresent or mislead. And in the camp that we have in peaceful science, we really care a great deal about this. I have acknowledged many times errors I've made in engaging with ID people and otherwise. Even Nathan Lentz, who's an atheist working with me, he has done the same. This is just how we work. This is how science works. This is how we build trust. And we're having a hard time trusting arguments from people that can't acknowledge these simple errors. And remind people that it is just not enough to be right. You have to be trusted too. One of the real risks that I think is facing intelligent design right now is that you're not trusted. Even if you're right, no one will believe you. And I think there's only one way out of that. You have to build trust. One of the best ways to do that is start showing us a way, or start engaging in the type of scientific exchange that we experience in PhDs, where we start conceding points, we go back and forth, we can also leave bad arguments. That's really what I'm hopeful for. I think that there's an opportunity for that. It doesn't have to be the way it's currently been. It's also one of the reasons why I really felt it's important to break the second rule and be public about my disagreements with this book. I want you to know if there's an opportunity for something better. This is from another workshop in January, just a couple weeks before the article comes out. This is Nathan Lentz, who's one of the Darwin Devolves reviewer. This is Walter Bradley, who wrote one of the foundational books that launched the intelligent design movement. Some people called him one of the core 3 members of launching intelligent design. Here he is sitting next to Nathan Lentz talking about the science of Adam and Eve. We had an amazing time with atheists, Jewish people, young earth creationists, old earth creationists, and evolutionary creationists, and me, who doesn't really fit any of these labels, sitting there. This is Jordan Mantha, the other guy right there, who's also a biologist and a Christian professor, all just sitting down talking about how to make sense of population genetics and scripture together. We're not trying to exclude you. We want to include you. This is just how science works, that we're going to disagree in public in times. Pointed this out before, I think I'm going to continue to be a very complex figure in ID for a while. I want you to know that, that I'm really on your side in a lot of ways. If we can find ways to work together and engage more deeply, I think that I'll be honest and open when I agree. When you have a point, I'll be clear about it. There is a cost to it. I'm also going to be public and honest when I disagree. And I hope also we can come to some better ways of engaging this that don't become so personal, don't become so bewildered and upset. This is just how science works. And we really want to find ways to do this better. Honestly, if there's something I missed, I really want to know it. Help me understand it, and I'll be public about that too. That, in a sense, is really what the heart of what we're trying to do at Peaceful Science is. I hope you look us up there and realize that it's a grand invitation to look at the grand questions together. We may not always come to the same answers in the end, but science is actually more driven by questions than by answers. So there are going to be some costs. one of the costs is going to be that we have to be able to tolerate disagreement from one another. And maybe we'll find out that some of the arguments that we really cherish aren't as strong as we thought. But in the end, I think there's still an opportunity for a better sort of society, a better sort of community. And I'm really welcoming everyone here, including Intelligent Design, to be part of that. I think it's going to be a bit of a rough go. It's a bit rough and tumble, but I'm not here to oppose you. I'm here to welcome you in. So with that, I'll pause. It's been about 45 minutes, and we have about an hour and 15 minutes for questions and answers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Swamidass. That was an interesting presentation. This is the interactive portion of the program. If you would like to ask a question of Dr. Swamidass, you can click the raise hand button at the top of your screen, and I'll be very happy to promote you to panelists to have a discussion live with Dr. Swamidass. You can also submit questions in textual form if you prefer. There's a Q&A button at the top of your screen. If you want to submit anonymously, just click the anonymous button and it will submit it anonymously as well.
Okay, so I got a question too. There's 29 or 27 people here. Is that normal for you guys or more than normal?
It's actually more than normal. We've had more, the most we've ever had is 65 in one go. So it's not the most we've had, but it's more.
Well, thanks for coming out, guys, and joining the conversation with us.
I had a few questions. Let me kick off since we don't have any hands currently raised or questions submitted.
So going down into the chat, though, I want to talk about one question that came up there real quickly, and then you can ask me. One person said, "Is it ad hominem?" There's been a question about whether or not we're actually giving ad hominems. I'll point out John West himself in his review points out that we have not made ad hominems. In his response to our review, points out that we have not made ad hominems. He was very harsh with us. He said what we did was fraudulent. Behe has said that we're incompetent. We've not done that. I have not at any point said he is a liar, and I don't think he's actually lying. We've never gone after his person. We're just saying, and our assessment is that his work ignores these things. That is not an ad hominem. That might be more direct than we're used to outside of science, but this is how science works. That's just how it is. I get much harsher critique from my colleagues all the time. That's just how it works. Go ahead.
Okay. We had a question submitted, so I'll read that question. This is from Robert Walter. He says, could you go over explanation of irreducible complexity through neutral evolution? Is there evidence that such things have happened?
Yes, there is evidence that things like this have happened. You can see this arise in simulations, and you can see this also. There's actually several lines of evidence that points to this. You can see it by once again, you can see through simulations. You can also look at the differences between different organisms, and you can see that the vast majority of them are neutral. You can also see this in experiments too, where you see the vast majorities are neutral. And at the same time, mutations are often interdependent. And so there's something that's predicted from theory, it's demonstrated in simulation, and it's also, we see evidence that's consistent with it in nature.
Okay, we had a question here, but they've lowered their hands, so we'll go to one of my questions. I read your science review, your article in Science reviewing Behe's book. And just leaving aside for the moment, parking for the moment, the question of whether you find Behe's responses to previous critics of his work convincing. My question to you is, why did you claim in your science review of his book that he doesn't address critics or contrary evidence? Specifically, you said in the review that he avoids evidence that challenges him. Now, you claim elsewhere, including in this webinar, that you want to give Behe and the intelligent design proponents a fair hearing. So how does that square with your claims in the science review, which, to my mind at least, having investigated it, are false?
Well, I think the context is important, and we explained this ahead of time, and I've already explained it already. I'll explain it again. That was a review of his book. That was not a review of him as a whole. It was not to say that he has never published words explaining his response to things. Now, the way how I would explain this is I think there's a little bit of a clash between scientific culture and how it's commonly understood response. When I publish a paper, I have to get it peer reviewed. What happens in peer review is I send my paper off, a bunch of scientists come back, and they will tell me what they think is wrong with it. And then I have an opportunity to respond to what they said. Now, if they don't like my responses, they think that my response did not actually engage cogently with their critique. Even if I say that I did, they will say this is a non-responsive response. That's what they will say. And that is an assessment that we make as scientists that is not about whether or not there exists words that rebut it, but whether or not that those words, those articles actually engage the critique. So that's what's meant when we say, in a broader sense, that he's not responsive. Behe has not been responsive to the critique against him, even though there's been many words published. So I'm just trying to say that's what it means. So if you mean it to be literally, he has never published an article on his blog or somewhere, well, of course that's false. No one's meant it that way. No one ever claimed it that way. We're rather saying that he has not been responsive. And in his book specifically, I gave you the example of Alan Orr, he dramatically critique against him to the point of quoting one of his critics as an endorsement rather than actually engaging what he said about him.
Okay, I mean, my concern is that you essentially insinuated in your article that Behe doesn't even acknowledge this criticism. I'll give you a direct quote from your article. You said that, and I'm quoting here, a 2014...
In the book, he doesn't actually acknowledge it. So,
yeah, but the point is that he's published responses elsewhere. Why does he need to repeat himself if he's already responded elsewhere?
The appendix is important. He says that he's updating the reviewers on the status of Darwin's black box.
Right. So for example,
he does not acknowledge. I mean, so that's what he says his purpose is.
But you state in your article that a 2014 study, unmentioned by Behe, reported discovery of 2 genetic paths through which malaria has evolved chloroquine resistance through multiple steps. That's the 2014 study by Summers et al. But it's not true that Behe has not interacted with that study. You can find...
we never said that he's never interacted. In fact, I knew about that study beforehand. I've never said he's never interacted with it. We've looked at it in detail. We've responded to it. You can see me writing and engaging with it long before he published that review. That review was never meant to say he never engaged with that article.
But you understand that Behe actually, in a series of articles, actually argued that that paper, far from contradicting his thesis, actually confirms his thesis that...
Well, we understand his argument, and we think it's non-responsive. And the reason why we've explained this several times, too. Art Hunt has published an article 8 years ago that Behe has not engaged with. We approached him privately about it before the review. He was unwilling to. We pointed to him when the review was published. He refused to respond to it. We pointed out to him again after the review, and he refused to respond to it multiple times. And then the only response that came out to engage with this actually was an anonymous post from Ian Veeves that conceded several points. And we asked Behe to clarify if he agreed with that post or not, and he did not do that. So the thing about it is, like, I understand one incorrect reading that has been pressed by the Discovery Institute is that we're claiming falsely that he never engaged with this work. That is just blatantly not true. That is a not correct reading of what we claimed ever, publicly or privately. We've never thought he never wrote a response to these things. We just don't think it was a responsive response.
Wouldn't it be more accurate, though, to say, rather than it's unmentioned by Behe, that he's responded to this elsewhere, he didn't cover it again in the book, we don't find his response elsewhere very persuasive? Wouldn't that be a more accurate way of putting it?
That would be more accurate. We didn't have enough words.
Okay. Let's review the other submitted questions.
But by the way, I'll say that we didn't have enough words to put that in the science review. That was said before, immediately during, and immediately after, multiple times. We've repeated that over and over again publicly, that we know that.
Okay.
So
okay.
It's not like I'm trying to hide that.
Okay. Okay, we have a couple questions that have been submitted, so let's go to those. Ben Kissling asks, do you think that if you had read Behe's book and decided to give a positive review, that Science would have published it?
I don't know. I think that, I don't know.
Okay.
And I would say that I don't know if it really matters, because I think in the end what really matters is if he can convince his colleagues. If he could have convinced me, and he could have convinced Nathan Lentz and Art Hunt, and we published, we tried to submit that to Science, because they'd actually commissioned, they already said that they wanted it from us, actually. If they rejected it for that reason, I still would have gone public with that review. And in the end, he would have ended up winning. And so I think that's, if Science didn't publish it, I think that would have been to his advantage.
Okay. We have another question here submitted by Jonathan Bartlett. He asks, if you believe that Science has moved on from Darwinism, then in what way are you really disagreeing with Behe? wouldn't that actually mean that he is agreeing with where science is right now? If science has actually moved on from Darwinism, wouldn't the response be, yes, he's right? If there are remaining people who think that Darwinism is valid, they should agree with Behe on this.
Yeah, so this is where it gets to the issue of misrepresenting science. If all he was saying was that positive selection to dominate change is not sufficient to account for what we see, not only would I agree, but a large number of scientists would agree. The problem is that he misrepresents current theory as if that's what actually we think. So he presents that as a cogent critique of current understanding in evolutionary science. That is a grand misrepresentation. And I repeat this over and over again. It's entirely correct that positive selection directed change does not account for very much at all. I completely agree. Paul Braderman, who was once again an atheist, in his really cogent review in Three Quarks Daily, he makes the same point. He says that, yeah, the technical definition that he's using is completely correct. That is actually not enough to account what we see. We figured that out. I think when Behe, unless he was a genius who skipped high school, that's when he was in high school. We figured that out in high school and moved on. So the equivalent analogy would be a person coming forward and making a critique about how Newtonian dynamics doesn't account for the precession of Mercury. Newtonian dynamics is just not a complete theory. It doesn't account for everything we know. And so therefore, we just have to have major questions about modern physics. That would be a very strange argument. Of course we agree Newtonian physics doesn't account for everything. It's just not sure what that has to do with a cogent critique of modern physics. And that's the problem, is that there's a large misrepresentation of science embedded in the claim that it's a critique of Darwinism.
But it seems to me that Behe has an entire section in his book, entire chapter devoted to the modern extended evolutionary synthesis, including.
But what I'm talking about is not the extended evolutionary synthesis. Actually, I'm just talking about where evolutionary science has gone for the last. So I'm actually not an extended evolutionary synthesis. I think that's a mess of a discipline. I'm not even going there to that. I'm just saying what we found out in 1968, what we found out in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. And yes, he does mention them. And if you look at it, the chronology is really strange. He's talking about, there's all these other extensions, and he mentions neutral theory and Kimura. But it's Kimura, like I said, published his seminal work in 1968, not after Darwin Devolves. And so it's a strange out-of-order history he's presenting. He does raise it. I completely acknowledge he raises it. He even acknowledges that it's important for some things, but then he raises it to say that it's not important for his argument. And his reasons for saying why it's not important to his argument are not correct. And so what that he does then is he kind of says, I've raised it, I know about it, and then I'm going to put it into a box and ignore it going forward, and then he ignores it. And I think that that's just not going to be a coherent argument that's really going to touch where modern evolutionary science is. I mean, it's fine if he wants to do that, but it's not really even engaging where modern evolutionary science is.
I guess I would have to disagree. I mean, the reason I brought out the fact that he has a chapter on the extended synthesis is to point out that when he's using phrases like Darwinian or neo-Darwinian evolution, he's meaning in a broader sense than simply,
Well, that's fine, but when it gets to actually engaging with things and looking at specific things, he doesn't look at, for example, the vast dominance of neutral changes over positive selection. He even goes so far as to say that if it's a positive selection, if it's a neutral change that causes complexity, it's just not important. That's not what he cares about. So all he's arguing about is we're about 0.1 or 0.01% of changes, and saying that that's always destructive. Maybe that is, maybe it's not. I actually don't think he's made the case that that's primarily destructive. But that ignores where 99.99% of things are, and those can be constructive. In fact, a large number of them probably are constructive by the exact same de-evolutionary means that he's claiming.
Okay. Let's move on to another specific question. This is from Jonathan Bartlett. He says, I also find it odd that you criticize Behe for thinking modern evolution is Darwinistic, but the review of his book that you pointed to as being a very up-to-date review, Evolution Unscathed, is itself Darwinistic.
Yeah, so this gets to the multiple definitions of Darwinism. And so there's been definitely press releases out there. I think when you look at actually what's out there in the public on this, Darwinism means a whole bunch of different things. I disagree with how mainstream science is being portrayed. I'm explaining as a scientist from within evolutionary science that the technical definition of Darwinism is not actually part of science as a complete explanation of modern evolutionary science. That's just a fact.
Robert Walzer says, what does Lenski's work show as far as the power of natural selection acting on random DNA mutations? To me, this is a poster child of what Behe is arguing. The longest evolutionary experiment in history has shown what the mechanism can do, namely break things for short-term gain without any thought of future need.
Yeah, so I think there is a couple really interesting things about this. First of all, I would say that this is really important to a paper called the Nasval paper, which we cited in our review, which is the title is Real-Time Evolution. It was a science paper. That was another, that they're both designed experiments. Lenski's experiment is designed for one purpose. Nasval's experiment is designed for another. When scientists do experimental evolution experiments, they design them to test specific questions. As Lenski explains, the reason why he designed the LTE experiment was not to ask the sorts of questions that Behe is asking. It's actually a context that's meant to favor degradative change. And so for that reason, to look at that experiment and to extrapolate to all of evolution is a scientific error. That's how Lenski understands it. That's how I understand it. That's how the vast majority of scientists looking at this are going to understand it. Now, there are other experiments designed to help us understand the limits of evolutionary mechanisms, specific evolutionary mechanisms. And we presented one of those to Behe. His response was, well, it's a designed experiment, so it doesn't count. We think this is a bit of a strange sort of objection because all experiments are designed. And if that's going to be the objection, then it's somewhat self-defeating. He can't really appeal to Lenski's experiment either, because that's designed too. It's designed to degrade genes. So I would just suggest that, maybe those sorts of like surface level arguments we should kind of let go and start looking at the specific hypotheses being tested and engaging with them instead of trying to do dismissals like that.
We have a hand raised from Brian Miller from the Discovery Institute. Hi, Brian. Great to have you with us.
Hi. Can you hear
Brian,
me?
good to see you, by the way.
We can.
Good to see you. You all hearing me okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Joshua, thank you for your talk. And one thing that'll be helpful in the conversation is being very careful to clarify when examples are given, what sort of changes are we talking about? So for instance, if you talk about a classic example would be an enzyme in a bacteria that's now able to dissolve a different type of toxin. You're dealing with like a protein that has a minor change, which then allows it to do some change. Because it's dangerous when we conflate all different types of evolutionary changes. And the main point of Mike's book, to make this clear, is that you see changes at the level of a genus and species. But when you're looking at large-scale changes, like at the level of a family, of a phylum, the Cambrian explosion, you're dealing with qualitatively different types of changes. So you give a lot of wonderful examples of how small-scale changes can take place, like enzymes adjusting. But I think the big challenge is when you're dealing with a macroevolution, what we don't see are the sorts of mutations that can drive these major changes. So for instance, if you want to change a body plan, you have to mutate the developmental genes which affect the basic architecture of an animal, the three-dimensional shape of the bones, how they interconnect, where different organs are located. And what, in your opinion, would be the best example of a mutation that's been observed that could drive that sort of large-scale change, like the change of a developmental network?
That's a great question. So first of all, I would say that we have observed these sorts of things in the laboratory. Of course, I understand that Discovery Institute will say that it's a designed experiment, so it won't matter. I hope that you guys can give up that argument, but we have observed them in the laboratory. An example of one, which I think is a really good one, is I posted, I can actually give you the name of the author, which I'm blanking on right now. He actually posted a series of papers in the 1970s and 1980s looking at the evolution of a new organelle and how there's an amoeba. This is basically the precise mechanism proposed for how mitochondria and other sorts of organelles arise, where there's an amoeba that is infected with a bacteria, and then both the bacteria and the amoeba lose the ability to live independently. And so then now it's become an obligate symbiote to the point that it starts degrading and it becomes essentially an organelle. That's an example of a major evolutionary change. Like, that's a step change. It's directly observable in the lab. And we see that. That's one example. The other point I would say is that I think that there's major changes between us and chimpanzees. We are just very different than chimpanzees. But when you look at our genomes, we don't see any evidence that there's changes that required anything more than small changes along the way. That doesn't mean that God didn't do something that was a large change. It's just that we don't see the evidence. In a lot of ways, I think that Behe would agree with me on that. He doesn't actually make the case because though he does believe that God was involved somehow with human evolution, he doesn't actually think there's any strong evidence for it because it's below the family level. And when he looks at the changes between us and chimpanzees, that looks like Mount Everest to him, that God designed it, but he doesn't know exactly how. I think a lot of it, that is really what the disagreement is. It's not about whether or not, God did it or if he was involved. I think God did it and didn't. He was involved with Mount Everest. I just don't think that the evidence is as compelling as you guys are convinced. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, I may not have asked my question clearly enough. In the example, I'd love to see that paper, by the way, with the amoeba and the bacteria. That sounds super, super interesting. I suspect in that example, what you'd find is that the different organisms are using they're using structures and systems that are already there to adapt to the situation. More specifically, do you know of a mutation in?
No, actually, it's actually devolution. So what's going on is that the bacteria is doing fine living on its own, but then it loses the ability by breaking things to live independent of the amoeba. That's something you guys should believe is likely. And then the amoeba loses the ability to live independently of the bacteria. So there's no reason to think that it isn't actually devolution building up complexity.
So you're saying that these things are breaking things that allow them to live together better?
Which leads to a net increase in complexity.
Okay, good. So this is an example of Behe's saying how things can break, which is good. Let me be more specific. In a macroorganism, something like a mouse or a worm, do we see mutations which are altering the fundamental architecture, the change of the developmental network? Is there? And let me tell you why this is important.
But let me press back. Like, why do you think that that's necessary? I don't see any evidence that that's necessary for evolution.
Oh well, when you look at, let's say, the genomes of different phyla, they have new genes, they have new genetic networks, new cells. There's changes in the architecture of where organs are placed. There's new organs. So there is a lot of macro changes taking place. This is really important because if you look at the Cambrian explosion, you're dealing with about 10 million, I'm a physicist, I'm doing orders of magnitude, like 10 millions of years for a new phylum to come into existence. So you're talking, if you're super conservative, let's say 10,000 really significant mutations that change architecture in a given organism. And if you look at the number of species, we should be seeing every day mutations which are creating these architectural changes. Are you familiar with any of those sorts of mutations that are beneficial or neutral?
Yes, I'm familiar with many of them, but I have to challenge some of the premises of what you're saying here. So, well, first of all, body plan is a very poorly defined term. The way I understand it, whales and humans have the same body plan. So, I think you have to specify that much more clearly. So when you say body plan is actually a very fuzzy term, I think part of the point of what we see when we look at the fossil record is that the same body plan can produce very different outward forms.
Oh, great. A mutation where you see this change of an outward form, like a starfish.
That's not a body plan, to be clear. That's not a body plan.
Well, fine. What would be the most impressive example, however you want to define it, of a mutation that did some significant architectural change in a macroorganism?
Well, so it's all about standard of evidence, right? So, I think the whales are a pretty impressive example of how that happened. You see an immense amount of, we have an immense amount of information about exactly how that all worked. We can see convergence at the molecular level for echolocation. And you can see that a lot of them, they have what seems to be a trail of history in the past that shows that many of these genes are breaking down. That's true. but we also see gain-of-function mutations. The other example I'd point to too is with dogs. We're getting more and more information about how there's these large changes to their outward form, and we're understanding more and more how that actually makes sense in terms of actual genetic changes.
Well, my understanding is like all the organs in dogs are in the same place. They have the same basic architecture, the bones, the arteries. And again, a danger is when you go into circular reasoning, and this isn't a criticism, it's just a caution, is that when you look at whales, you assume they evolved from a land animal, you see changes, and you assume that change happened through a blind and undirected process. I'm not saying that's bad.
No, I did not assume it happened through a blind and undirected process. At no point did I make that assumption.
Okay, fair enough. But and again, I think the challenge is when we look today, what mutations have we seen, or what mutations are currently spreading through any species, which would allow for these architectural changes, like changing the relative positions of organs, changing a structure in the brain? What would be the most impressive mutation you're aware of that we've seen in the last 100 years?
But Brian, that's just not how I think as a scientist. As a scientist, I ask it a different way. I ask like if like this evolutionary hypothesis is true, what would we expect to see? Which is different than the question you're asking.
Well, that's fine. That's fine.
So let me explain my reasoning here. So we would first of all expect that these sorts of mutations would be rare. So we don't actually expect from that point of view to see them frequently arising. We don't expect to see that very often. So that's the first point. Mm-hmm. The second point is that that when you actually look at these examples, you find out that while you look at things today, they seem like totally different. That when back in time, that they don't actually look nearly as different as that. So maybe even the jumps that we have to do are a lot smaller.
Could you clarify that? When you say, what's a specific example of what you mean when you just said that? They look different. They don't look as different in the past. What do you mean by that?
So if what we have to do is evolve a cow into a whale, that's a big problem.
Right.
Okay? That's just not actually what evolutionary theory proposes. When you look back in time, you see animals that don't have features like the animals that are alive today.
Uh-huh.
And so when you start looking at those examples, you find out that actually life on Earth just looks different than it looks like today. So we don't have to think about a cow. Even a cow isn't the best example. A better example would be evolving like a seal into a whale, even though it's not precisely a seal, or like a hippo. And so, I think you can see a much more plausible, range of like steps along the way to get there. And I had a final point, was actually fairly important, but I just dropped it, so I forgot it. So I'll tell you when I remember it.
Sure, thank you so much. Well, one thing I would challenge is that if you look at the time scale of the Cambrian explosion, the number of mutations you'd expect, that would be like, in a very, very conservative sense, that would be like a mutation in an organism every 1,000 years. So if you look at the sheer numbers of species we have today, we would expect a lot of those massive mutations to take place, but we don't really have any. So I think that's sort of a disconnect that might be useful to explore.
Oh, yeah. Now I remember actually what the issue was. So part of it is that, so I'm a medical doctor, okay? Mm-hmm. So during my medical training, we learn about human anatomy in a book, okay? And you get an idealized form of it. But we also do anatomy lab, and the way how we did it was a little bit unique and different in my medical school, at least when I did it, in that none of us were assigned a particular body. What we did is we actually rotated through bodies as we were looking at the bodies, and we found out actually that there's actually quite a bit of anatomical variation. Mm-hmm. So it turns out that there is actually there's a much higher degree of variation in anatomy in humans than we often realize. And I think that we see this even more. And actually, humans don't actually have that much variation. We're outliers. If you start looking at other animals, you have to take into account the variability. The whole point of what we're wondering about in evolution is, some of that variability is important, and you can select for it. And so, until we start engaging that variability, that's actually where we think that the action is. That's actually how it works out with dogs. So dogs used to be wolves. Wolves are, fairly, well-defined in a particular way, but they have variation with them. And then in a very short amount of time with selection for particular traits, you can amplify those sorts of changes and make something that looks very different from a body plan, an external point of view, that can be traced down to several different mutations at the lower level. And then the fourth point, I'm kind of giving this out to you, and this is also going to be recorded. So, I mean, I can actually explain these in more in depth on our blog and all that too. But a key point here too is that if you take populations into account instead of just looking at individuals, it not only becomes likely, I think when you start thinking about millions of years, it starts to become almost certain that you're going to be exploring a large portion of the close mutational space of that genome, to have mutations from several different places that can be combined together to produce even coordinated changes. I just don't think that that this is a real problem from a mathematical or a genetics point of view to see how that could happen.
Well, let me ask you one more question to make it specific. So with, let's say, the human brain, you're going from a primate brain, an Australopithecine or whatever, to a human brain, you're seeing a large increase in complexity, structures, density, and so forth. And if you look at the human population over the last century, it's far, far larger than our ancestors. So that means the number and variety of mutations that have taken place in the last century with humans is equivalent within, a factor of 2 or 3 of the mutations between, let's say, an Australopithecine and Homo erectus. So have we seen any mutations in humans in the last century that have, let's say, created new neural networks in terms of new structures, anything along those lines? What would be the most impressive example of that you could think of?
Well, as an example, well, to be clear, once again, I start the way I think about this scientifically is I start by asking, what do we expect? And,
Right.
Population genetics is really important here. So what's happened is there's been a large number of smaller mutations that have been made, but they haven't been strung together. It's kind of like we've looked at every single direction we can go one step away from us, and there's maybe billions of ways to go one step away from us, but there hasn't been a way to explore how to go 1,000 steps away from us. So it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges. We don't actually expect that. Now, at the same token, we do see actually mutations that do change things quite a bit. There's been some pretty surprising advances that I didn't even expect 2 years ago, and uncovering what the evolutionary basis for human brain evolution is. And I can explain those in detail. And what's really interesting about this is that they're not just there's been a couple of really solid papers. There's one in Cell that's really good, where you can show how you take an existing gene, you duplicate it, and you modify it. And that actually, you can take that gene, you can put it into mice, and it actually improves their cognitive ability, and it changes their brain structure. And it looks like it's a modification of an existing gene. It's also tied to an evolutionary mechanism of instability. I think it's on chromosome 11 or 1. I'm blanking on that once again. It's the Duff 1220 genes. So we're getting information in this in a way that I didn't know was possible, and it's being supported actually also by experimental results, which is also something that is not what I expected. Now, I want to be really clear, that doesn't mean that God didn't do something at some point. This is not meaning he's undirected in a theological sense. I think God providentially governs all things. So this is not argument against God, but this is certainly undermining an argument based on genetic evidence that God had to have intervened from a scientific point of view.
Okay, thank you.
So, I would point you to that brain evolution one too. I think it's a really phenomenal study.
All right, thank you, Brian, for your participation. Let's see, we have some questions submitted and also a hand raised. I also have a few things I wanted to ask. Let me go to one of my questions that I have for you, and then we'll go to another caller or take some more Q&A. In a Darwin Day article that was posted on the website Adventures in Poor Taste, Nathan Lentz, who's one of your co-authors in your science review, claimed that Behe's argument about chloroquine resistance is that it's too complex to evolve. And of course, Behe actually, if you read The Edge of Evolution, argues quite the opposite. He argues that chloroquine resistance is a good example of something that's within the edge of evolution and capable of evolving. So, and when on your Peaceful Science blog, on your Peaceful Science website, when asked if there was an error, Lentz said that if he had erred at this point, that he would certainly admit to it and correct the error. And then you yourself said that if he made an error, then he would indeed retract that error. To your knowledge, has Nathan Lentz retracted that error? Because I've not found any evidence that he has retracted it. even though this was about a month ago?
That's a really good point. So I would say in my assessment, he got that part wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think he got that wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to speak for him. I think he got it wrong. I think he has to. I think he has to actually retract that if when he gets to the point of understanding that's wrong, or convince me I'm wrong too, or the other way. And what I'll say about Nathan is that he has actually retracted errors when pointed out in the past. A little bit hard to do it on an emotional level too, I would say, when people are calling you incompetent, frauds, and many other things we've heard from Discovery Institute. But I also do know that Nathan has a character that he's going to look past that and do what's right. So that's where those things stand. Now, one thing I did actually ask of Behe, I asked him privately, and I've asked his supporters to point out, and I also have raised this publicly. I actually really honestly want to know if he's ever conceded a point and said that he got something wrong. I know for a fact Nathan has. I know that I have. I honestly just want to know if he's ever done that in his 23-year presence in the public sphere. Has he ever done that? And I'd love to know. I just don't know of any case. And I don't even know how I could have gotten through. I don't know how I'm going to get through the next 3 months without making an error that I have to retract. So I'm just wondering if that's even part of what he does or not.
We have lots of questions coming in. One is from an anonymous attendee who says, what, if anything, would you change about your review now if you could?
I think what I would have done differently is I would have probably fought harder against the subtitle. I didn't realize it was going to be used as the main title. It's not the title that we chose. I think that created confusion because people thought we chose that title, and it's a bit disrespectful of the title. Our title was The End of Evolution with a question mark. There was other titles that were thrown about, not to pick anyone. One of them was Behe Devolves, which I objected to, and actually we all objected to in the end, because we thought that would have been rude and unkind. And I think that really confused things. I think also I probably would have added some qualifying phrases, because we were reviewing the book. We weren't reviewing him as a whole. But it was taken as if we were reviewing him as a whole. So I would have probably added a qualifying phrase to make that clear, and more clear in the review. At the same token, I did reach out to the Discovery Institute and Behe before, during, and after to explain that to them. And they knew that that was our point when they pressed a different narrative.
Okay. I have another question about, I've already raised, in your article you said a 2014 study of unmentioned Behe reported discovery of 2 genetic paths through which malaria has evolved chloroquine resistance through multiple steps. Now, people who are who are familiar with Behe's argument were extremely puzzled by this sentence, because it actually affirms Behe's argument that when chloroquine resistance evolves, it requires multiple steps. And your citation here is to Summers et al., which of course Behe's mentioned, and as I mentioned earlier, he's addressed this in no less than 10 articles.
So is Art Hunt here? He was here earlier. Art Hunt, can you raise your hand? I think he's there. Well, Art Hunt, I'll explain what the issue is. So the way how we saw it is that none of the things we cited, except for the one reference that Behe ignored, dealt directly with Behe. These were starting points in literature where there's been discussion in the past where we know that there's been back and forth exchange with Behe, and we don't think he's been responsive in the scientific sense. Not that he's never actually responded. We don't think he's actually engaged in arguments. So we actually intended to restart the conversation, because he references in the book and re-raises what's in the book, the conversation that happened between Larry Moran and Behe. There's 2 arguments that are going on here that he's making. On one hand, he's making an argument from a mathematical model, okay? On the other hand, he's looking at an epidemiological study from White, and he's using those 2 to say they come to the same conclusions, so we have confidence. So when Moran points out the problems over here, for example, pointing to the Summers et al. Paper, Behe will come back and say, but the epidemiological study is strong. And we got this here. And so we were referencing that debate. Now the problem that's going on here is that the Summers et al. Study shows that his math really is wrong. But the other problem, which we pointed to repeatedly, which has been out there, like I said, since 8 years ago, we repeatedly asked Behe to respond to, and he has not responded to, is that he directly misquotes the White study. He gets the epidemiological analysis wrong. So not only is that his analysis incorrect here, but his analysis here is actually just a quote line. And so we wanted to engage him on that. And what happened instead is we got an anonymous post from ENB that concedes several really critical points. And this is a problem because we've seen several times how Behe supporters have just defended him without actually really representing him correctly. We really want to know where he stands on this. And the key point is he's claiming that for the White study, that the key step was just two mutations happening. That is a complete misinterpretation of White's comment. It's a quote mine, it's not correct. And in fact, there's a lot more complexity that's involved in getting what you can call a chloroquine complexity cluster. And that means that this is not important. There might be as many as 10 or more mutations required to get from here to here. That's why it is so rare to see it. So that ends up going away as an argument, and he can't use that to rebut what Larry Moran said.
Okay, so the way that I had interpreted your comments in Science, and I may be mistaken in the way that I read it, but the way I interpreted it was that you believed inaccurately that in The Edge of Evolution, Behe had argued that chloroquine resistance can't evolve. Is that not what you were saying?
No, that is not what I
believe. Okay.
I think I've said this too. I think he thinks it's the limit of evolution. You can't get much farther than that. Mm-hmm. But you can do that, obviously. Okay. Because he's pointing to like this is as far as you can get, and this is how I know is because it's epidemiological study. But his analysis of that epidemiological study is it's actually nothing more than a quote mine. It can't be justified the way he's using it. Okay. And based on that quote, he then dismisses much more careful engagement from them, and we've tried to engage with him on that. And he's refused to respond. We got an anonymous post from ENB that conceded several key points. We responded back to Behe saying, well, that's great. Do you agree with this post or not? He has not actually responded. So right now, where that conversation stands is I agree that Nathan Lentz made a mistake in representing that. But, and I agree that Behe's engaged on this topic before. And it also appears that the ENB post makes several major concessions on Behe's past, on his behalf. We want to know now, does Behe actually agree with that article, or is he willing to write one of his own explaining his position? And that's what we're waiting.
Okay. I've not read the White study, so I will, when I have looked into that, I'll write something on it, but I don't have it right.
And we're happy to engage and explain this before. Like, we're not doing a drive-by or a hit piece on him. Like, this was a genuine attempt to engage things that we brought up in private with him before, and have been brought up for years with him before. And instead of engaging with us on these things, we got something else. I mean, I'm pretty surprised that we were called incompetent for pointing out clear errors on his part. And, you know, it's fine if he's going to be uncivil that way. That's fine. We're going to treat him fairly and be kind to him and back. But, you know, this is just not what we expect from scientific colleagues.
Okay, so we have some questions submitted. Anonymous attendee says, Dr. Swamidass, you agreed that the polar bear white fur coats are due to damaged genes responsible.
No, I don't actually agree to that.
Let's read the questions. It says, are due to damaged genes responsible for the production of pigment in hair follicle cells, right? Therefore, Behe was right in this case beyond a doubt, right? So you
false. Say that is just totally false. This actually reveals a deep misunderstanding of polar bear biology. He has a particular answer that he knows he has, that he'll be selective at how he looks at it. So you look at polar bears, do you think they're white? Do you think it broke the melanin? Maybe that's what happened, but it's far more complex because it turns out that polar bears make an immense amount of melanin. They make melanin and they put it in their skin. They're actually, if you shave them, they're the blackest of black. So it's possible it's a degradation mutation, but it is far from certain that's the case. We don't know exactly what's going on. And beyond that, there is a question about even how to define what degradation is here. We have to know exactly what that does. We have to do biochemical studies. We cannot conclude, based on the evidence, if that was a degradation or not. The computer programs don't. All it does is tell you that there was a change in function. And so I just don't think we know.
Okay, let's go to a caller. This is Robert Walser. I'm just going to bring him up. Hello. Hi, Robert.
All right, can you hear me okay? Hello? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Good.
Okay. So actually, I'm still a little bit stuck on that slide that you had with the A and the B and the irreducible complexity. And let me just make 4 or 5 real quick points and then let you respond, if that's okay.
But can you just tell us which slide it is? I'll put it up.
Yeah, you had A and then B.
Oh, I got it.
A.
Sure, I got it here.
I'll wait.
No, you can keep on talking. I'm listening.
Okay. Well, it's not a small thing for proteins to stick together. To get and I'm not a protein chemist, but to get the right shapes in both proteins, there are many different ways that can be done. And then, okay, so, and assuming that you were able to overcome those objections and get them to stick together, even so, that they would retain their original function would be, I think, not as likely. And then if you're talking about a system with multiple components, now, well, let me make a point. I appreciate you're trying to make sense of this, because the arguments against irreducible complexity that have been used before, I think, are not on the up and up. But and I think that your argument at least is a scientific attempt to be reasonable. But nevertheless, all these things. So let's say you get B and A, and let's say that they're stuck in a good place that 10 steps down the road would lead to some positive machine. But even so, getting all those mutations all working together, all at the same, well, it's not going to be at the same time, it's going to be over time, still keeping the proteins functional. You know, proteins have to be in the right place at the right time. So if they're aggregated, they might not be able to get to all the places they need to get. Anyway, it just, I mean, I appreciate it, but I don't know if it's feasible. And even so, let's say that it's reasonable. Let's grant you that. Even so, we need to see some sort of example of something like that, or it's just an idea and not a fact. Anyway, that's all I have to say on that.
Yeah, what I would say, first of all, is that this is not my argument. This is actually Doolittle's argument. And this is actually the common understanding of biology since at least the 90s, because I first learned about this when I was a college student talking to people about Darwin's black box. So this is not actually something new. This is just explaining how biology works as I understand it. And since then, we've had an immense amount of additional evidence demonstrating that this is probably how things work. One great example of this is the ENCODE data. We've seen an immense amount of biochemical activity that is not directly connected to function. And in fact, it's also highly variable from individual to individual. This is actually a really key point. So it turns out that, for example, protein interaction networks are going to be different individual to individual without any real clear evidence that has any particular importance. That's just neutral changes. So yes, I understand that our instinct is, our intuition is that, well, it's a whole bunch of very tightly interacting parts like a mechanical machine, but that's actually not how most of biology is. What's going on actually is something really different, where these things are floating around and they usually are working correctly, but you know, they can devolve to have less specific interactions, and that doesn't gum up the works. It actually is okay, it's just tolerated. And then when that happens, then you know that can start to become required. And then this is just the way how you expect. That's actually what the theory predicts, is that you're going to see highly irreducible complex structures that arise. And then down the line, and by the way, this is going to be happening without selection, just happening, well, except for negative selection. If it's something that hurts things, that won't continue on. But what's going to happen is just an immense amount of complexity, a lot of control points and knob points, where when you move into a different environment, then maybe something that was neutral in the first environment starts to actually become valuable in this new environment. And that can allow for relatively rapid change, especially as you can see how several different things that were there neutrally before and never together in the same spot, when we start putting together, that can produce larger changes. So this makes sense from a population genetic
argument, correct? This is Doolittle's argument? What? This is Doolittle's argument?
Well, I mean, I say Doolittle's argument, I mean, it's almost giving him too much credit. He's, I'd say, writing down on paper what has been relatively well-known and uncontroversial for decades. And so I think he gave it a clever name, irredeemable complexity for fun. He's been talking about constructive neutral evolution as a way to explain coagulation pathway. the spliceosome, and electron transport chains. And this makes an immense amount of sense to me as a biologist, that this is just what you expect as things devolve, even though that's not exactly how we talk about them in science, just as things are breaking down from what you might think their intentional, their initial function is, that you're going to get increased complexity. That's actually what you expect from information theory too. That, you know, entropy, as an entropy of the system increases by this, it increases the complexity.
Yeah, but okay, I hear what you're saying, but for all the multiple parts to come together, and for instance, just A and B, you'd have to maintain those mutations in A and B. They're not selected for, they are selected against if they're diminishing function, and you'd have to hold on to those mutations while C, D, E, F, G, H, I, etc. are continuing, and everything could go back and forth because it's neutral. So for all of it to be retained.
Yeah, so it's actually kind of entertaining how this works out. So I actually had we were talking about this on our blog, and there was a friend of mine, Andy Walsh, who published a really excellent book called Faith Across the Multiverse. He's a Christian computational biologist. And I said, hey, you know, you should build a simulation on this. And so he did. He actually went and built a simulation based on this, okay? And he did it first starting off at X-Men. And he's developing this further. And it turns out that what it kind of ends up with is he has like a little drone that's going around. It was Cyclops, but we kind of made it a little bit easier. Where the job of this little guy to go around and destroy 4 Sentinels. You add in a couple more Cyclopses, and you just let them evolve neutrally. You find out eventually you start sharing the job and start becoming an irreducibly complex team. That's just what you expect from a neutral evolution. You can see this. I mean, we can argue about it semantically, but if you just put it into a simulation, you'll exactly see this. I mean, this is exactly what you expect.
Okay, but even if I don't know in detail the simulation, but let's grant that. So even so, how definitive can you be when you don't? Are you saying there actually is experimental data also apart from simulations?
Yeah, so I pointed out some stuff too. So one example is that there's a great deal of variability in protein interaction networks within humans that are apparently normal. That's a really important point. That demonstrates that it's not nearly as rigid as you're imagining.
I think we have a different definition of experimental information then, because let's say there's some variability in proteins. Nevertheless, it's one thing to say that, it's another to construct a complex machine with multiple parts, each interacting in a necessary way together.
But we have to be really careful and precise on this. That's one reason why I really like the internet forum, because it allows us to take claims one by one. So when you look at something like this is synthesizing several small claims that we can understand, test in laboratory, and are not taken on intuition. Okay, and so you are uncertain about this because you raised questions with a lot of those small claims. So I'm not demonstrating the whole thing, I'm just saying, so for example, you said the chance of a new thing coming and binding like that is actually very low. I'd say, well, we can actually test that. We can test that with data to find out if you're correct in that intuition. We can then go look at data and we can actually come to an answer. And so then that's what I was saying, was when you actually look at the variability of protein networks, that actually answers your questions about how likely is this to happen. We find out it's actually extremely likely. It's represented in existing variation. So that is no longer a valid reason to reject this. Then we can go through all the small claims like that. Okay. And I'm just saying that part of what's going on is the understanding of biology that that you might have might be very intuitive and seem like it makes sense, but just biology doesn't follow our intuition always. Sometimes it's surprising, and we actually have to get those little facts correct before we can actually start reasoning at a higher level. And so once you see all those small facts in line, this will be a very plausible thing. Then you actually can go look and test to see if there's evidence of that actually happening in actual macroevolution, looking at differences between animals, and we actually see evidence of that. And you can actually see evidence of that in vitro in laboratories, and we actually do. You can actually see examples of irreducible complexity evolving in the laboratory. For example, we were just in a long conversation with several ID proponents showing how how scientists are able to evolve an irreducibly complex beta-lactamase out of a very tiny library. And with something that actually fits very closely to this model.
Okay, well, I mean, you're bringing forth claimed data that I'm not familiar with. So on my part, I would have to dig in and find if.
Yeah, I understand. I'm very sympathetic to you. So for me, I first read about
the same conclusions as you are, and so I'll just yield at this point. But in general, it does seem incredibly fantastic and unproven, although you're saying that's not the case. And that's all I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just very sympathetic to you. So when I first, you know, I was a student. I mean, I was a Christian. I was a young Earth creationist, actually, until I read Hugh Ross's books. And that kind of opened my mind a little bit. I'm still a Christian, by the way, of course. I've actually become really good friends with Reasons to Believe. You know, I became an older creationist. I remember reading and really being convinced entirely of Darwin's black box. The thing about it, though, that happened, though, is that I just actually started talking to my biology professors, and they did not, they were not rude or cruel to me about it. They did not reject me. They did not embarrass me. They just explained it how they saw it. And I was just shocked. What actually shocked me the most is how different their understanding of just the basic facts of biology were from what I'd learned from intelligent design. And that was very destabilizing. I just found out that if I'd only read intelligent design and never talked to them, I would have never really understood how most biologists understand biology.
Well, I'm totally open to reading whatever articles are out there, but every time I've looked to the killer defeaters for intelligent design in the scientific articles, I found that they kind of vaporize. They have either bait and switch.
Well, so this is why actually the fact that the reason why I'm pressing, so look, I agree with you, but here's the issue. That's not how biological reasoning works precisely. For us, we have to get agreement on a lot of small basic facts.
Sure. Yeah, and I have no argument with that.
And so this is actually why it's so critical. And I'm not trying to be picky with Behe about, for example, acknowledging that he misinterpreted the computational results or that he misrepresented the author. The thing about it is if we can't even get agreement on small facts, it's hard to imagine how we can make progress. You know, the way it works in science, you know, we often make errors in the small facts.
I'm 100% with you. I'm 100% with you on that.
So this is kind of where I'm struggling, where, you know, maybe he's right on something and we missed it, but until we can actually get to the point where we can start getting agreement on the small facts that may or may not have, you know, be defeaters for him, it's hard to know how to make progress. And as far as I know, he's been unwilling to yield a single thing on this to anyone. It's not even about me. I don't think he's been willing to yield to anyone. So it makes it very hard to engage with him as a scientist.
I'm not directly familiar with the things that you believe are defeaters to things that Behe said. So I would have to.
Well, no, what I would say is it's not a defeater the way you're saying. I'm just saying that there's a large number of incorrect facts that each individually may not be a defeater, but you put them all together and it's not actually a good representation of evolutionary science.
If you are correct, then I need to look at things differently. And I'm good at this point.
Thanks a lot for your really respectful kind of engagement.
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
Bob, yeah.
Thank you, Robert. By the way, did you are you aware that in your science article there's actually a miscitation to an anthology article by Ken Miller, which in the article you said is actually addressing the blood clotting cascade, but is actually addressing the flagellum. Were you aware of that?
Yeah, so it's not a miscitation. So I actually engaged with this. There was a long exchange with Tim McGrew's daughter there about this. So I didn't actually put that citation in. You know, one of my co-authors did. We looked into it. He was wanting to give a citation to the blood coagulation thing. The problem is that the key citation is actually a website. And we even clarified this right away as it was published because we knew this at the time. And explained to Behe, saying this is actually what we're referring to. We want to give Ken Miller credit for it. And he does mention it briefly there. And the actual mechanism is explained in the webpage, which you don't actually use in a science review. And I also point out too that in the Evolution Journal, I believe they actually do make a citation to that. I wouldn't say it's a citation, I would say it's a weak citation. I also actually explained this too to Tim McGrew's daughter that there is this challenge we have in the conversation where the vast majority of the literature out there for intelligent design is not actually in peer-reviewed published journals. And that includes both the stuff coming out of ID and the stuff engaging with you guys back. And this is kind of creating a problem. Most of the dialogue is actually in like digital forms that are not actually standard scientific publications, and it creates these, like, I would say, these warts in the process when we try and engage in the peer-reviewed literature. It's a problem. I think we need to find a way to solve it, but that's just where things stand right now.
From my perspective, from my observation, there's a lot of ID research published in peer-reviewed journals. I mean, there's a list actually at the Discovery Institute website, but there's many dozen articles published in scientific research journals or other scientific venues.
Yeah, but so for example, there's no place that has all the exchanges over the summer's articles with
Sure.
Larry and with Behe. What I would have liked to have done to actually cite Behe's response to Larry and Larry's response to Behe.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been the right way to do it, okay? That might have cleared up confusion. It would have made it, that's just not how you do it in the scientific literature. Now, maybe that should change, but I'd say the more important exchanges are actually these back and forths, because, that's where the really key claims are clarified, is actually in that exchange. And we don't really have an opportunity to cite that. So I'm not making a grand assault at ID. I'm just saying that even the rebuttals of Behe are not in these places, and it's a problem, and it creates a place where we can't actually cite the places we want to. So we cited the Summers paper rather than Larry's and Behe's response, okay? So that would have been clearer. And now I do think that that's been by some people at the Discovery Institute, that fact has been exploited to say that we're misrepresenting him. That's just not factually true. We've been very clear up front that we know that he's engaged. We're engaging with him. We're pointing to them. We're linking to it. That's just not true. I mean, the only reason why they're doing that is because they're trying to save face. I think that's pretty clear.
We have some more questions submitted. Jonathan Bartlett says, is it possible that the problem is evolution presented publicly in the media and high school textbooks by scientists and the public is still Darwinian? If that were the case, then this would make his criticism quite relevant.
Yeah, can you say it a little bit loud? Repeat that. You kind of cut out there for a moment.
Okay. He said, is it possible that the problem is that the way that evolution is presented publicly in the media, in high school textbooks, and even by scientists and the public is still Darwinian? If that were the case, wouldn't this make Behe's criticism quite relevant?
So I would say yes and no. So if his criticism was that it's being that actual evolutionary science is being misrepresented as Darwinian, he would not only have not negative reviews, he'd be getting positive reviews from us. That would not be a problem. The problem is when it's claimed that that's actually what the best evolutionary science is. And so therefore evolutionary science has a problem. That is where the problem comes. Now I'll say on that first point, I've been taking that case publicly forward and no one's giving me flack for it. I've said several times publicly that I think that representing science as evolutionary science is primarily a positive directed change is a major error. I think it's confusing. I don't think it's correct scientifically. I think it creates unnecessary conflict, and we need to stop doing that. I said that. Coyne has seen me do that. Richard Lenski has. Nathan Lentz has. On Darwin Day, I even published an article from a young Earth creationist asking kindly to retire Darwin Day. I think that there's this point where I am making that case publicly, and I'm allowed to do it. In fact, I might even win that case in the long run. But I'm not doing it by saying that evolutionary science has a problem. I'm saying that when you do it that way, whether you're doing it intentionally or not, you're actually not giving the public the best science that they need to hear. That's a strong argument.
A question submitted by someone called JMac. He says, Dr. Swamidass, as a medical doctor, if your 89 patients ate a very high-fat diet and had extremely high levels of cholesterol and signs of heart disease, would you conclude that the lack of atherosclerosis in your patients was due to beneficial mutations in ApoB protein?
I don't really know what the question, I don't understand how to engage that question exactly. We don't look at ApoB mutations as medical doctors right now.
He also wanted to ask, the researchers of the original paper in Cell about polar bears concluded that the mutations in ApoB protein that is linked to the LDL cholesterol transportation system prevent heart disease in polar bears, and yet, according to the same article in Cell, polar bears' cholesterol levels are extreme. As a medical doctor, do you agree with paper's conclusion? How could the conclusion be that the mutations improve the LDL transportation clearance if polar bears' cholesterol levels are extreme? Isn't it a contradiction?
What I would say is I agree. Unlike Behe, I agree with the author's conclusion, tentative conclusion, that it looks like it's most likely to be an increase in function of ApoB, that they also quoted to the press and is actually in that paper too. So I agree with the conclusions of the author that tentatively it looks like a gain of function, though we don't know for sure until we do the experiments.
Okay, an anonymous attendee says, if sequence space is for the moment intractable and the ancient environments and ancient fitness landscapes are lost, is it equally an argument from ignorance to say that a specifically Darwinian mechanism of evolution can make a major transition, as it is to say that it cannot? Both seem to make conclusions based on
I would go farther to say that we know that the Darwinian mechanism can't. So what exactly is the argument? That's just not how it happened evolutionarily.
I think he means mindless processes.
Well, so this is where I think I'm mapping out a bit of a third ground. So Dawkins would say, or let's just say, I'm going to use an archetype that's not quite Dawkins here because I don't want to put words in his mouth. Like someone might argue that we see evidence that shows that evolution is capable of all these things. We don't see any evidence against it. And so maybe that's all there was. I think that last step is too far. There's no evidence that anyone can produce that God did not intervene or get engaged to do things. And there's no evidence that we can show that it was never necessary. It's entirely possible so that God was necessary at a point, but we just can't tell from a scientific point of view. And so I just don't think science gives us an answer that way. And so when there's an aggressive atheist pressing that evolution's really solved it all, can explain the full diversity of life, I don't actually think that's true. I think what evolution does is it explains quite a bit. It shows that there's a plausible explanation to make sense of quite a bit of it, but we don't actually know ultimately if it explains everything. And maybe even God was necessary. And I'm fine with that. And I think actually even most scientists are fine with that. I think what we have a really difficult time with is an argument that fails on a factual level and on key points to make a case for that. We don't actually hate God. I mean, I affirm God. I believe God created us all. I think the problem is that we really, really, really don't like bad arguments. We can be pretty aggressive about bad arguments. I think that is actually just how biology works, for better or for worse.
Carrie says, can't Lenski's experiments and other experiments show serendipitous results, even if his experiments didn't shoot for those answers? How do neutral mutations affect change, especially change past the family level of taxonomy? The primary engine that moves past the family level. What are the primary extant examples of mutations that show this can happen?
So well, that was a change in topic, right? So which one do you want? The examples that show this can happen, or the stuff with Lenski? We have to divide that into two questions. Can you help me out with that? You have it in front of you.
Sure. Do you want to use Lenski? Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you give me that question again here?
Sure. Let me just get it. So he says, can't Lenski's experiments and other experiments show serendipitous results, even if his experiments didn't shoot for those answers? How do neutral mutations affect change, especially change past the family level of taxonomy? What is the primary past the family level? What are the primary examples, not simulations, that show this can happen?
Well, so Lenski, so I'll just deal with the two of them separately, the best I understand it. So one is, can there be serendipitous things in Lenski's experiment? There was, and Behe calls it a sideshow. He didn't mean it to insult, but I think he actually misunderstands what happened in the experiment. Behe wrote a blog article which gets into this. What actually happened is that they do see actually exaptation, they see innovation, they see generation of new function in those bacteria. Behe's argument is that, but it's just taking stuff that already exists. It's not popping the gene into existence. Now that's a little bit of an exaggeration. I don't have his quote in front of me, so you'll just have to let me correct that online if I need to. But from our point of view, evolution doesn't need to pop genes into existence with no precursors and non-coding DNA and all that sort of stuff. It just needs to take what's there and modify it slightly to create a big change. And that's exactly what you see there. So the objection that we get doesn't really make a ton of sense to us. Now, in terms of what are the great examples that we see of this, well, there are several examples. I mean, I've given you many already. But like I would say is that, science doesn't work by these sorts of big knockout punches at the high level. It's going to be pulling together widely agreed upon small facts that we can come to agreement on, and then putting together in sensible ways to make sense of a large amount of data. The problem that we're having with ID right now, and Behe in particular, is that we disagree on a very large number of the small facts, and there's no way to come to agreement because, as far as I know, he's never conceded a point.
With more specific questions, Ben Kissling asks, what is your view on methodological naturalism?
I think methodological naturalism is a very poorly named reality of science. The fact of the matter is that if God was actually doing a miracle right in front of us, we'd start looking for the natural causes of the miracle. And so in that sense, science is just totally blind. You can wonder if that's just an error in science, but if you actually go back to the history of science in this and the philosophy of science, I see really clear statements of methodological naturalism by Bacon, who was a Christian. And also you see this coming up by Robert Boyle, who's considered the father of intelligent design, and you can even see it precursors to that. What I would say is that what's really behind methodological naturalism is a theological distinction between the creator and creation. And that science isn't allowed to really engage questions about the creator's action. It only asks questions about creation, and in that regards, it'll be blind when it deals with God's action. That's my view of it. I think that makes a lot of coherence of a lot of things. That explains why we see immense amounts of research in design detection in science, but we don't actually see people considering divine design detection as something that's legitimate science for the most part, because that actually follows this distinction of the creator-creation divide, where you're going to treat the creation's design very different than a creature's design. It gets also to why I think that it really gets also to the distinction between Mount Everest and Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore is designed the way a human would. I think God created Mount Everest too, but he created Mount Everest in a totally different way than I would as a human. Creaturely designs are not the same thing. They're not similar. They're not analogous in the way we might think to the creator's design. And I think that's a really important theological point that the founders, the early scientists knew. And that's actually one of the key innovations of how modern science progresses, not by methodological naturalism by that name, but rather by a very strict adherence to a creator-creation distinction.
Okay, another question submitted by Jonathan Bartlett. Behe believes that evolution itself was designed, and that this is his whole point. For evolution to work, someone with foresight must have set it up. Therefore, when someone creates an evolutionary pathway ahead of time with foresight, why should Behe think that is in conflict with his ideas?
Because, first of all, that misses the point. This gets back to the whole issue of the small versus the big. There's small points that are made that we can demonstrate in the laboratory. When we demonstrate those things, the objection is, well, that's a lab experiment designed, and it doesn't show macroevolutionary change. But that wasn't the point of raising it. We were explaining a detail that we can demonstrate in the laboratory with an evolutionary mechanism. So it's an example of misrepresenting science, ignoring evidence against them by giving a really fallacious response that doesn't actually engage the small question we're trying to do with it. In terms of evolution being designed, I agree. I think God created evolution. I think if evolution could do anything, it's because God enables it to be the case. That is not the argument. The argument is rather about how correct and valid the scientific case being made for that is. And I can entirely agree with Behe that God designed evolution and providentially governs it to his purposes. I entirely agree with him there. That doesn't mean that 1 + 1 = 3. I'm still allowed to say, 1 + 1 actually equals 2. And I don't mean that to be disrespectful. It's just that that's how science works. It's actually those small claims that we have to engage. And maybe we don't think that they're important for the large claims, but if we can't get on the same page on the basic facts, there's no way to make the larger case. I think right now, what I'm observing between the larger scientific community that I'm part of and the intelligent design movement that I'm sympathetic to is that there's just massive disagreement on the small details about biology, which builds up then to when you make your bigger cases, we're just dealing with alternate realities. You're arguing about biology in a way that we don't really see that that's how biology is. And if biology was that way, maybe you'd be right, but we just don't think it's that way, and we're dealing with it on a daily basis. And when we try and bring this up, it's silenced. And I want to find a way through that. I want to do better, but we have to get to a point where we can start getting to basic understanding on basic facts.
Okay, let's take 2 more. Let's take this question from Ola. He says, do you think natural selection has the power to remove most deleterious mutations, or are the genomes of most species degrading over time? If the latter is true, isn't that a challenge to macroevolution?
Oh, I think it's the former that's true. So, I think evolution has no problem getting rid of the deleterious mutations it needs to. I say neutral theory is important, but I think a better way to put it is near neutral theory, where most mutations are going to be a combination of neutral or close to neutral, slightly beneficial, slightly degradative. And that's actually a good thing. That allows there to be functional differences that are below the threshold of selection, but there's also positive and negative. When you get near neutral mutations, the balance of deleterious to positive is no longer skewed the way it is at the extremes. And when you have recombination involved, and there was a really interesting study recently done to show the mechanisms of how Mueller's ratchet is avoided in Y chromosomes for humans too. There's other mechanisms around this too, in addition to recombination. It turns out to be, I think, essentially a solved problem of how you deal with deleterious mutations. Except, I would say you can find studies that'll show that there is a problem, but it's always under models of evolution or distributions of mutation that I don't actually think are actually reality.
Okay, let's take 1 more question. Folks, if you want to...
By the way, Ola, thanks for the question. And I've been following your work on the waiting time problem, and I think really trying to engage this in depth and mathematically is important. I think you're doing good work, so thanks for doing it.
Mm-hmm. If anyone wants to raise their hand and come up as a panelist for the last question, then I'll give you a minute. If not, we'll take another text question. Okay, let's take another text question. Let's see, which one should we go for? Someone asked a question about the origin of life, John Baling. He says, what are your views on how first organic life formed? What is the fine line between looking for purely naturalistic mechanisms and recognizing an intelligent agent in the formation of the first life? If we find specified complex information in the first life or a simple single-celled organism nowadays, at what point do we go against traditional intelligent design science deduction going on in forensics and SETI? Why is it allowed in some scientific disciplines such as computer science, i.e. the design inference written by Cambridge University Press, and not in biology?
So several questions there. One is what I think about origin of life and how this actually fits in with methodological naturalism and what's the distinction between this and SETI. What I'd say is the way how I just defined methodological naturalism solves this. We have no problem with aliens designing things, but the question becomes, and the reason why is because we can actually do additional types of scientific analyses to cross-check things when it comes to the design of an alien that we can't do when we're talking about the creator. So we can look at creaturely design, but we can't look at the creator's design effectively with science just because it has to do with the limitations of the fall limitations of theology, the limitations of human senses. We just can't actually engage that scientifically. Now, that being said, I think scientists need to be upfront and honest that we don't actually know how the first cell arose. We have a couple theories. None of them are settled. It's an immense place of debate. We don't really know. I'd say we don't even really have a plausible mechanism to explain it all. We're at the limits of what's possible scientifically, and it's entirely possible that God definitely had to step in. That's possible that he definitely had to step in and create the first cell. There's nothing that makes me uncomfortable about that as a scientist and even saying that publicly, and I'm not even going to pay a cost for saying that. The problem becomes when we take our lackage of knowledge there as a strong argument against it. And I'm looking at those arguments closely. I'm trying to make sense of where they're coming from. I've talked to Brian Millers about this, and he's been trying to kind of develop this from a physics point of view. I will agree with the intelligent design argument that there are absurd headlines coming out all the time about origin of life researchers solving how the first cell arose. I think those are absurd, but I have not yet seen definitive evidence that it couldn't have happened by natural processes. I think as a Christian who thinks bigger than science, what I could just say is that science hasn't figured this out yet. It's trying to. It should try to. It should definitely try to. And it may never be able to figure it out. But even if it did have plausible mechanisms, that doesn't mean God didn't do it. And I just think that there's an openness we need to have to people talking about God intervening in places where we just don't really know. These are complex mysteries we don't know.
Okay, well, thanks for coming on, Dr. Swamidass. It's been an honor. And thanks for your engagement with the questions and for your presentation.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me and treating me with such respect. Like I said, I know it's been a little bit complex lately, but I want to find ways to be a colleague and a friend to you too.
Well, thank you so much. Likewise. All right. Have a great rest of your day.